Analysis. Charter 97 reports that Ukraine's armed forces conducted a covert operation to detonate a critical junction of the Druzhba oil pipeline in Russia's Bryansk region, using a remotely controlled detonation system. The attack was not conducted by drone or missile. According to the report, Ukrainian operatives or partisan cells operating inside Russian territory had established physical access to the pipeline sufficient to plant explosive charges, then withdrew and detonated from a distance at a moment of their choosing. The Druzhba pipeline, its name the Russian word for friendship, is the primary artery through which Russian crude reaches the few remaining European Union member states still dependent on it. It has now been attacked 5 times since August 2025, as confirmed by CNN in December 2025. The latest Bryansk explosion was designed as a secondary strike, ensuring that Russian repair crews arriving to address earlier damage would encounter additional sections destroyed. The pipeline has carried Russian oil revenues for decades and was the mechanism through which Putin's government applied energy pressure on European governments. It is now a disrupted infrastructure system in active kinetic engagement. The attack's methodology is the detail that should concern Russian security services most. It was not an aerial platform or a long-range precision strike. It required someone to be physically inside Russia's Bryansk region, at the pipeline, for long enough to position explosive charges and then leave undetected. Whether conducted by Ukrainian intelligence assets, partisan networks operating behind Russian lines, or a combination, the operation demonstrated a deep penetration capability operating in territory Russia considers secure. The Moscow Military District fuel pipeline. United 24 Media reported a separate operation conducted by Ukraine's main intelligence directorate, the GUR, the destruction of a 400-kilometer military fuel pipeline operating within the Moscow Military District. 3 main military oil lines in the region were targeted simultaneously in a coordinated strike. The pipeline fed armored vehicles, aircraft, and air defense batteries protecting the Russian capital. The strategic logic of targeting military fuel infrastructure inside the Moscow Military District is distinct from targeting frontline logistics. Forces positioned to defend Russian territory from direct attack, including air defense systems covering Moscow itself, are sustained by this infrastructure. Its destruction does not immediately affect the Ukraine front. It degrades the logistical capacity that sustains Russian military readiness in the district considered most strategically secure. The refinery campaign. Numbers and economic impact. Forbes documented a systematic Ukrainian long-range drone campaign targeting distillation towers at major Russian refineries throughout 2025. Distillation towers are precision-engineered structures not replaceable under existing Western sanctions conditions. The Baker Institute for Public Policy documented that by early October 2025, Ukrainian strikes had damaged at least 21 of Russia's 38 largest oil refining facilities. 38% of Russia's primary refining capacity offline or severely degraded. Bloomberg's calculations identified approximately 120 Ukrainian attacks on Russian energy facilities in 2025, with 81 targeting oil refineries directly. The Moscow Times confirmed approximately 160 successful strikes on oil production and refining facilities across 2025. The Moscow Times also reported that losses from insurance coverage of terrorism and sabotage risks exceeded 100% of premiums in 2025, rising several multiples due to the frequency and intensity of strikes. Russia is one of the world's largest oil producers. It cannot produce sufficient refined gasoline for its own population. By early 2025, occupied Crimea, the territory Putin seized in 2014 and described as a showcase for Russian governance, had introduced gasoline rationing. Civilians queue for fuel. Public transport routes have been reduced. Military units receive priority allocations. The civilian population receives what remains. The budget impact. Charter 97, citing official Russian data independently confirmed by the Ryazan Analytical Institute, reported that Russia's oil and gas budget revenues fell 34% year-on-year by November 2025. The institute noted this figure likely understates the true damage, as November tax payments reflect October operational data. December price trends indicated a steeper decline was probable in subsequent readings. According to Euronews, oil exports constitute approximately one-third of Russia's entire federal budget. the primary funding source for military operations, soldier pay, missile production, and domestic social spending. Economist Vladislav Inozemtsev told Euronews that the strike campaign was extraordinarily well targeted. Hitting a refinery means weeks of burning, structural damage requiring months to repair, and an inability to rapidly redistribute production to compensate. A drone production facility can be rebuilt in days. A refinery cannot. The Shadow Fleet campaign. When Western sanctions and the G7 oil price cap of $60 per barrel were imposed in 2022, Russia constructed a parallel maritime export infrastructure, a fleet of aging tankers flying flags of convenience from Panama, Gambia, and the Comoros, registered through shell companies in the UAE, Hong Kong, and anonymous holding structures designed to defeat sanctions tracking. By December 2023, estimates of the Shadow Fleet ranged from 1,000 to 1,400 vessels. Ukrainian intelligence estimated approximately 1,337 vessels operating in the network as of February 2026, 1 in 6 tankers in global maritime trade, roughly 17% of global tanker capacity. Ukraine began targeting this infrastructure kinetically. According to the Wall Street Journal, cited by Charter 97, Ukraine disabled or destroyed approximately a dozen Shadow Fleet tankers through 2025. The campaign escalated through the autumn. The Ukrainian Security Service, the SBU, conducted its first long-range strike in the Mediterranean Sea in December 2025, targeting a sanctioned tanker that had recently delivered Russian oil to India. The SBU also struck tankers Virat and Chiros off the Turkish Black Sea coast in late November 2025, followed by an attack on the EU-sanctioned tanker Dashan. In early March 2026, the vessel Arctic LNG caught fire in the central Mediterranean, following a suspected Ukrainian drone strike. As documented by maritime security analysts at Go Ships, this was the first confirmed attack on a vessel from Russia's liquefied natural gas Shadow Fleet. The Arctic LNG had been operating in defiance of US, UK, and EU sanctions since 2024, transporting LNG from the Arctic LNG 2 project, and was reportedly laden with Arctic LNG 2 cargo at the time of the strike. Ukraine had escalated its maritime energy campaign from crude oil tankers to LNG carriers. The legal pressure has compounded the kinetic pressure. The European Union has sanctioned close to 600 Shadow Fleet vessels, applying packages of approximately 41 additional ships through December 2025. The United States sanctioned 183 tankers in a single package in January 2025. Ukraine blacklisted 656 vessels in a single decree. Zelensky characterized the Ukrainian package as the largest sanctions action ever applied against tankers working for the aggressor. Charter 97 reports a record volume of Russian oil stranded at sea with no buyers, no insurers, and no willing operators. Russia's Shadow Fleet, constructed to defeat sanctions, is now being defeated by a combination of kinetic maritime strikes, multilateral sanctions packages, and the unwillingness of third-party operators to assume the risk of both legal exposure and physical attack. Turkey's exit. Charter 97 reported that Turkey's largest oil carrier officially suspended operations involving Russian cargo after one of its vessels was damaged in a Ukrainian naval strike on a Shadow Fleet tanker in the Black Sea. A Turkish shipping company ceased Russian-related business following the incident. The legal risk of U.S. secondary sanctions and the physical risk of Ukrainian drone strikes in the Black Sea had made Russian cargo economically unviable. Without reliable Turkish maritime partners, Russia's Shadow Fleet export operations in the Black Sea became structurally exposed. Belarus. The Moser refinery consequence. The Druzhba pipeline explosion in Bryansk did not only affect Russia. The pipeline is the primary crude supply line for Belarus's Moser oil refinery, the economic mechanism through which the Lukashenko regime has sustained itself. Belarus refines Russian crude at Moser and sells refined products to European markets, or back into Russia at a premium. This transit revenue has been the operational financial base of the Belarusian state. Without crude flowing through the Druzhba junction, the Moser refinery has no supply. Lukashenko loses transit revenues, export income, and, critically, the refined fuel required to keep his internal security apparatus operational. The regime's ability to fuel its own police and paramilitary infrastructure is dependent on the same pipeline now burning in Bryansk. Putin, managing Moscow's own 34% revenue collapse, is not positioned to substitute Belarusian losses with direct transfers. Belarus faces the Druzhba destruction with empty pipes, a financially constrained patron, and a population that has not been politically reconciled to the regime since the 2020 election crisis. Russia's agricultural and domestic fuel crisis. Southern Russia's agricultural regions, Rostov and Stavropol, have experienced critical diesel shortages throughout 2025, as documented by investigative reporting from the Moscow Times. Modern mechanized agriculture requires diesel, tractors, combine harvesters, and transport trucks moving harvests to storage facilities. When fuel infrastructure is destroyed and supply falls short, Russian military allocation has priority. Farmers receive what remains. The consequences cascade. Diesel shortfalls prevent timely harvesting, degrade storage logistics, and increase food costs in distribution. Russia's bread price is a politically sensitive indicator with historical resonance. Fuel depot destruction in Rostov, a logistics hub for Russia's southern military district, simultaneously degrades both civilian food supply chains and military operational capacity. Reuters documented wholesale fuel price surges inside Russia through 2025, despite Russia's status as one of the world's largest oil exporters. The distribution network connecting production to consumption is broken. When a refinery in Ryazan stops producing gasoline for the Moscow region, supply cannot be efficiently redirected from Siberia. Railways are congested with military logistics traffic. Regional fuel shortages, fuel deserts in analyst terminology, are developing across a country whose geographic scale makes alternative logistics routes exceptionally slow to activate. The Arctic LNG 2 collapse. Bloomberg reported that production at Russia's Arctic LNG 2 project collapsed by more than 90% in November 2025. The specialized ice-class vessels required to transport the liquefied natural gas are either under international sanctions, seized by Western authorities, or now under direct threat of Ukrainian drone strikes following the Arctic metagas attack. Storage tanks at the Arctic LNG 2 facility are at capacity. The ships are not arriving. The gas is trapped in Arctic permafrost, converting from an asset into stranded inventory. Russia's Arctic LNG 2 project represented a $21 billion strategic commitment to replace European pipeline gas markets, lost to sanctions, with liquefied natural gas exports to Asian buyers. If Europe would no longer accept Russian gas by pipeline, it would be chilled to liquid and shipped to China and India instead. The ship attacks in the Mediterranean, the sanctions on ice-class carriers, and the 90% production collapse have collectively defeated that pivot. Russia is not only losing today's oil revenue, it is losing the gas market infrastructure it built to sustain revenue beyond the Ukraine war. The energy revenue base of the Russian state, which funds military operations, domestic social spending, and regime stability, is being dismantled at both its current and future dimensions. The military logistics consequence at the front. The relationship between Russia's domestic energy campaign and frontline military performance is not abstract. It operates through a supply chain that connects the fuel depot to the tank to the assault operation. The Rostov logistics hub destruction illustrates the mechanism. Rostov is a primary logistics node for Russia's southern military district, which covers the Zaporizhia and Kherson fronts. When the depot in Rostov is struck, Russian logistics crews must source fuel from further inland. Longer supply runs, more time on roads that Ukrainian drone coverage has made progressively more dangerous, more mechanical wear on vehicles conducting extended runs, slower resupply cycles for forward-deployed units. Every additional hour a supply truck spends in transit is an additional hour of exposure to Ukrainian FPV drones and artillery. Field reporting that World Brief Daily has tracked indicates Russian assault operations in the southern sectors have been experiencing stalling episodes, not from Ukrainian counterattacks in the direct engagement sense, but from fuel and ammunition shortfalls that arrive between assault cycles. A tank column that runs dry between its staging position and its assault line has not been defeated by Ukrainian armor. It has been defeated by supply chain disruption that began with a drone strike on a fuel depot hundreds of kilometers away. The compounding effect is important. Each stage of the energy campaign, refinery damage, fuel depot destruction, shadow fleet interdiction, budget revenue collapse, reduces the financial and logistical capacity available for the next cycle of military operations. Russia's ability to sustain its current operational tempo, approximately 40,000 casualties per month, continuous assault pressure along multiple front sectors, depends on maintaining the supply chains that deliver fuel, ammunition, and equipment to forward positions. Ukraine's energy campaign is specifically targeting the financial and physical infrastructure on which that tempo depends. Hungary's exposure and the EU's internal fracture. Hungary is the EU member state with the deepest remaining structural dependency on Russian oil through the Druzhba pipeline. While most EU members have successfully diversified away from Russian energy since 2022, Hungary's Pax nuclear plant uses Russian fuel assemblies, and its Százhalombatta refinery, operated by MOL Group, is configured to process Russian Ural blend crude delivered specifically through the Druzhba's southern branch. Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has used Hungary's energy dependency as political leverage within the EU, consistently blocking or softening sanctions packages that would directly target the Druzhba supply. The Bryansk destruction places Orbán in a position where his political argument that Hungary cannot afford to cut Druzhba imports is being rendered moot, not by EU policy decisions, but by Ukrainian kinetic action. The pipeline is disrupted regardless of what Brussels decides or what Budapest negotiates. Hungary's refinery must source alternative crude at market prices or scale back production. The strategic consequence for EU internal politics is significant. Hungary's most effective instrument for blocking Russian sanctions policy was the credible threat that cutting off Druzhba oil would damage Hungarian industry. As Ukraine's pipeline disruption campaign makes the supply unreliable independent of any policy decision, that leverage erodes. The question for Budapest shifts from how do we protect the Druzhba relationship to how do we secure alternative supply chains? A question whose answer points toward the same market solutions that other EU members have already implemented. Slovakia faces a comparable situation. Slovakia's Slovnaft refinery, also configured for Ural blend crude and similarly dependent on Druzhba's southern branch, has been a source of political pressure within the EU, parallel to Hungary's. The Bryansk explosion affects both countries' refinery operations simultaneously, compressing the political space for continued Druzhba dependency arguments within EU institutions. The domestic political consequences inside Russia. The convergence of fuel rationing in Crimea, diesel shortages in agricultural Russia, wholesale price surges at Russian pumps, and the 34% revenue collapse in oil and gas budget receipts creates a domestic political environment that differs qualitatively from the one that prevailed in the war's first 2 years. In 2022 and into 2023, the Russian government could sustain a public narrative that Western sanctions were causing manageable inconvenience, that Russia's energy revenues remained robust, that consumer goods remained available through alternative channels, and that the economic pressure was being absorbed without fundamental disruption to daily life. That narrative required conditions in which energy infrastructure was functioning, consumer fuel was accessible, and the state could plausibly claim that the economic war was being managed. Crimean gasoline rationing is a direct contradiction of that narrative, visible to every resident of the territory Putin held up as the crown achievement of his first term. Russian farmers in Rostov, unable to obtain diesel for their harvest equipment, is a contradiction visible to an agricultural sector whose political quiescence Putin has historically taken for granted. Wholesale fuel price surges at Russian gas stations, while Russia simultaneously exports record crude volumes, is a contradiction that ordinary Russian citizens experience personally, and that the state media apparatus has limited capacity to explain away. The Levada Center polling data showing 61% of Russians expressing support for peace negotiations in January 2026 reflects a population that is war-weary and materially stressed. The fuel shortage dimension of that stress, connecting directly to agricultural production, to personal mobility, to the perception of state competence, compounds the accumulated effect of casualty notifications, inflation, and the disappearance of imported consumer goods. None of these pressures individually is sufficient to produce political challenge to the regime. Their accumulation, over a multi-year timeline, shifts the internal political environment in ways that constrain the options available to the Russian leadership. The India and China variable. The two most important alternative buyers for Russian crude, India and China, are both experiencing pressures that complicate their role as the backstop for Russia's redirected energy exports. India, which had significantly expanded its purchase of discounted Russian crude following Western sanctions, faces a structural constraint from U.S. trade policy. Reports from early 2026 indicate that India is curtailing Russian oil imports under the threat of U.S. secondary tariffs that would make Indian access to the U.S. market more expensive if India is assessed as facilitating Russian sanctions evasion through continued large-scale crude purchases. For the Indian government, the commercial calculus comparing Russian crude discounts against U.S. market access is an asymmetric comparison. Russian crude savings are measured in billions annually. U.S. market access is measured in hundreds of billions in bilateral trade volume. China's response has been different in character. Beijing has continued purchasing Russian crude and has not formally reduced its volumes. However, China's negotiating position on the long-promised Power of Siberia 2 pipeline, the infrastructure project that was supposed to give Russia a large-scale alternative gas export route to Asia, has remained maximally demanding. China is insisting on near-domestic gas prices as the condition for proceeding with the pipeline, effectively demanding that Russia supply gas to China at below-market rates in exchange for the transit relationship. The pipeline remains unbuilt. Russia's negotiating position deteriorates as its alternative market options narrow. The combination, India reducing purchases under U.S. tariff pressure, China refusing to proceed with the pipeline on commercially viable terms, means the Asian market pivot that was supposed to replace European energy revenues is not functioning as Russia's financial planning had required. The strategic architecture of Ukraine's energy campaign. The Baker Institute's research characterized the campaign's fundamental innovation. From 2022 through 2025, Russia's shadow fleet circumvented Western sanctions through legal and financial maneuvers. New shell companies, reflagging vessels, finding alternative buyers. When enforcement remains within legal and regulatory domains, Russia can respond at comparable cost and speed. When enforcement becomes kinetic, when sanctioned tankers are struck by drones in the Mediterranean, the asymmetry inverts. Creating a new shell company and reflagging a tanker is fast and inexpensive. Replacing an oil refinery destroyed by precision munitions is slow and prohibitively expensive under sanctions. Ukraine has shifted the enforcement mechanism from the legal domain, where Russia can adapt, into the kinetic domain, where adaptation requires physical reconstruction that Western sanctions make impossible on the required timeline. The Chatham House analysis published in November 2025 noted that a global oil supply surplus has cushioned international markets against major price spikes from the Russian campaign, giving Western governments reduced domestic political exposure for supporting Ukraine's energy offensive. Time magazine's November 2025 analysis stated directly that if Ukraine sustains its attacks on refineries, pipelines, petroleum ports, and related infrastructure, it may be able to constrain Russian revenue sufficiently to force genuine peace negotiations. The pattern of Ukrainian strikes through early 2026, increasingly focused on port infrastructure, tanker corridors, and maritime energy assets, suggests the campaign is in its most operationally developed phase, targeting the export infrastructure that has allowed Russia to maintain oil volume despite refinery damage. The Baker Institute assessment: if Ukraine successfully targets crude export ports and pipelines, Russia's ability to substitute export volume for domestic production losses collapses simultaneously.